The moment Elliot Morse's polished leather shoe touched the rain-slicked pavement, the city seemed to hold its breath. He emerged from the back of his midnight black limousine like a monarch ascending to his throne, the downpour cascading around him in sheets that might as well have been parting just for him. Every raindrop that struck his $1,000 suit appeared to hesitate, as if even nature recognized the presence of power and wealth incarnate. The street, narrow and dimly lit by flickering street lamps that cast long shadows against the wet brick walls, felt like it belonged to him alone in this moment. Elliot stood there for a heartbeat longer than necessary, savoring the way the world bent to accommodate him. At 52, he had built an empire that stretched across 3 continents, a conglomerate of technology firms, real estate holdings, and media companies that made politicians return his calls within the hour and competitors lose sleep at night. His salt and pepper hair, impeccably styled despite the weather, framed a face that had graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune more times than he bothered to count anymore. The slight upturn at the corner of his mouth was not quite a smile, but rather the permanent expression of a man who had never heard the word no mean anything final. Tonight was supposed to be the crowning achievement of his already legendary career. Harlan Reed, the elusive billionaire investor whose portfolio read like a who's who of successful ventures, had finally agreed to meet. $1 billion. That was the figure they had been dancing around for months, the capital injection that would take Morse Industries from impressive to unstoppable. With Reed's money and connections, Elliot would expand into markets that had previously seemed untouchable, cement a legacy that would outlive him by generations, and prove once and for all that he was not just successful, but inevitable. He adjusted his silk tie, feeling the weight of his platinum cufflinks catching what little light filtered through the storm. The alley-like street he had chosen for this meeting was intentional, a power move in itself. While other CEOs might have selected a 5-star restaurant or a private club, Elliot understood that true power was displayed through unconventionality. Making Harlan Reed come to him, to this shadowy, rain-drenched location that looked more like the setting for a crime novel than a billion-dollar negotiation, sent a message: I make the rules. Thunder rolled overhead, deep and resonant, shaking the very foundations of the old buildings that lined the street. The sound pleased Elliot. Even the heavens seemed to be providing a soundtrack to his triumph. He could already imagine the press release, the way analysts would scramble to adjust their projections, the expressions on the faces of his rivals when they realized he had secured Reed's backing. His empire would become an unstoppable force, swallowing competitors and establishing dominance in markets from artificial intelligence to green energy. He didn't know that tonight would end his career instead. The street was almost theatrical in its atmosphere. Shadows stretched and twisted with each flash of lightning, turning ordinary doorways and dumpsters into ominous shapes. The pavement gleamed like polished obsidian, reflecting the weak amber glow of the street lamps and the occasional headlight from a passing car on the main road 2 blocks over. Water rushed through the gutters in small rivers, carrying debris and city detritus toward the storm drains. The buildings on either side seemed to lean in conspiratorially, their dark windows like empty eyes watching the scene unfold below. Elliot's driver, Marcus, stood at attention beside the limousine, an umbrella extended over his employer's head, though Elliot had already gotten wet in those first few seconds. The older man had worked for Elliot for 15 years and knew better than to speak unless spoken to, especially before important meetings. Marcus was good at being invisible, at anticipating needs before they were voiced, at understanding that his role was to facilitate Elliot's vision of himself as a man who commanded even the elements. A pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the street, cutting through the rain like searchlights. Elliot felt a surge of satisfaction. Punctual. That was a good sign. Harlan Reed was a man who respected other people's time because his own was so valuable. The vehicle, a sleek black sedan that was expensive but deliberately understated, glided to a stop 30 feet from Elliot's limousine. The positioning left a gap between the cars, a neutral zone where the two titans of industry could meet on equal footing. The sedan's rear door opened, and Reed's driver emerged first, a younger man in a sharp suit who moved with the efficiency of someone who had performed this routine 1,000 times. He unfurled a large umbrella and held it steady as Harlan Reed himself stepped out into the rain. Even from this distance, Elliot could see the investor was everything the rumors suggested: mid-60s, trim and athletic, with a kind of posture that suggested military training, or at least expensive personal training sessions. His gray suit was immaculate, his movements deliberate and controlled. Reed nodded politely in Elliot's direction, a gesture of acknowledgement between equals. Or what Reed thought were equals. Elliot allowed himself an internal smile. After tonight, there would be no question about who stood at the apex of this particular food chain. Reed began walking toward him, his driver maintaining the umbrella coverage with practiced precision, their shoes splashing through puddles that had formed in the uneven pavement. The rain intensified for a moment, the sound of it hitting the street rising to a roar that drowned out even the distant thunder. Elliot watched Reed approach, calculating, always calculating. Body language, pace, the micro-expressions that most people never noticed, but that Elliot had trained himself to read like a second language. Everything was proceeding exactly as he had envisioned. But then something at the edge of his peripheral vision caught his attention. A movement in the shadows near Reed's sedan, just beyond the circle of light cast by the street lamps. At first, Elliot dismissed it as nothing, perhaps a stray cat or debris blown by the wind. But the movement continued, resolved itself into a human shape hunched beneath a tattered awning that jutted out from one of the abandoned storefronts lining the street. Lilliana Good had been huddled there for the better part of an hour, trying to escape the worst of the storm. At 45 years old, she looked at least a decade older, her face weathered by countless nights spent outdoors, her dark skin ashen from exposure and exhaustion. The layers of clothing she wore, salvaged from donation bins and occasional charity handouts, hung on her thin frame like rags on a scarecrow. Her hair, streaked with premature gray, was plastered to her head by the rain that had already soaked through every piece of fabric she owned. She had lost count of how many nights she had spent like this, seeking whatever shelter the city's architecture accidentally provided. The awning was barely functional, torn and sagging in places, but it was better than nothing. Her feet ached from walking all day, searching for food, for money, for any opportunity that might lift her even slightly out of the pit her life had become. 3 years ago, she had been someone different. 3 years ago, she had an apartment, a job, people who knew her name for reasons other than pity or annoyance. But circumstances had a way of stripping everything away. Medical bills from her mother's final illness. Lost wages from taking care of her. The landlord who wouldn't wait another month. The job that disappeared while she was distracted by grief. Each domino had fallen with devastating precision, and now here she was, invisible to most of the world, just another shadow in a city full of them. The cold was seeping into her bones despite her layers. Her teeth chattered, and she wrapped her arms tighter around herself, trying to generate warmth through sheer force of will. She had learned long ago that complaining did nothing, that nobody wanted to hear about her problems. Survival meant staying quiet, staying out of the way, taking whatever small mercies the universe occasionally offered. When the 2 expensive cars had pulled up, she had shrunk further into her corner, hoping to remain unnoticed. Rich people meant trouble in her experience. They looked at people like her with disgust or, worse, with that awful pity that somehow made you feel even smaller. She had learned to make herself invisible around wealth, to become part of the urban landscape they could ignore. But the rain was getting worse, and the awning was failing. Water was now dripping directly onto her head, running down her face in rivulets that blurred her vision. She was so cold, colder than she could remember being in months. Her whole body shook with violent shivers that she couldn't control. Through the sheets of rain, she could see the sedan, its engine still running, small wisps of exhaust visible even in this weather. The driver had left it unlocked when he got out to escort the well-dressed man. Warmth. The car would have heat. Just for a few minutes, just long enough to stop shaking, to feel her fingers again, to remember what it was like not to hurt from the cold. She knew it was a risk. She knew these people would be angry if they caught her. But desperation had a way of overriding caution, and Lilliana Good was as desperate as a person could be. She waited until both men seemed focused on their conversation, until their attention was directed away from the sedan. Then, moving with the cautious urgency of someone who had nothing left to lose, she slipped out from under the failing awning. The rain hit her like a physical force, instantly soaking through the few dry patches of clothing she had left. Her worn sneakers splashed through puddles as she moved toward the sedan, toward the promise of even a moment's relief from the relentless cold. The street was empty except for the two cars and the men conducting their important business. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark white light for a fraction of a second. Thunder followed immediately, so close that she felt it in her chest. The storm was directly overhead now, nature's fury at its peak. Lilliana reached the sedan's rear door, the one on the side away from where the men stood talking. Her hand, trembling from cold and fear and desperation, reached for the handle. In this moment, she was not thinking about consequences or complications. She was thinking only about warmth, about survival, about making it through one more night in a city that had forgotten she existed. She pulled the door open. The soft interior light of the sedan illuminated her gaunt face for just a moment before she quickly climbed inside, pulling the door shut behind her as quietly as she could manage. The warmth hit her immediately, almost painful in its intensity after the hours of cold. She huddled on the floor behind the front seats, making herself as small as possible, praying that she might steal just a few minutes of this blessed heat before anyone noticed she was there. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and two powerful men continued their negotiation, completely unaware that their carefully constructed evening was about to be shattered by the desperate actions of someone they would never have seen as consequential. The stage was set. The players were in position. And the storm, both literal and metaphorical, was about to break over all of them with devastating force. The warmth inside the sedan was almost overwhelming after the brutal cold. Lilliana pressed herself against the floor mat, feeling the heat from the vents wash over her like a benediction. Her fingers tingled as circulation slowly returned, that painful sensation of frozen flesh coming back to life. She could hear the muffled voices of the two men outside, their conversation reduced to indistinct murmurs beneath the drumming of rain on the car's roof. For just a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes and remember when warmth had been a given rather than a luxury. 7 years ago, she had been someone entirely different. The memory came to her unbidden, vivid despite the fog of exhaustion, standing in her small but tidy kitchen in South Memphis, preparing Sunday dinner for her mother. The apartment had been modest, just 2 bedrooms on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better days, but it had been hers. The lease had her name on it. The bills got paid, sometimes late but always eventually. She had worked as a home health aide then, taking care of elderly clients who needed help with daily tasks, offering companionship to people whose families had drifted away or simply gotten too busy. Her mother had been her world. Margaret Good, a woman who had raised Lilliana alone after her father disappeared when she was 3, who had worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, who had taught her daughter that dignity was something you maintained regardless of circumstance. "Stand tall, Lily," she used to say, using the nickname only she was allowed to use. "The world will try to make you small, but you get to decide your own size." Then came the diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The words had hit like a physical blow, stealing the air from Lilliana's lungs and replacing it with ice. The doctors had been apologetic but firm. Aggressive treatment might buy time, but the odds were not good. Her mother had been 68 years old, still vibrant despite her years of hard labor, still full of laughter and wisdom and stories Lilliana had never heard. The decision to quit her job and care for her mother full-time hadn't felt like a decision at all. It had been as automatic as breathing. Margaret Good had sacrificed everything for her daughter. The least Lilliana could do was be there for her mother's final chapter. She had naively believed that love and determination would be enough, that somehow they would find a way through the medical bills and the lost income and the mounting debts. The next 6 months had been a blur of hospital visits, insurance denials, medication costs that seemed designed to bankrupt anyone without substantial savings. Lilliana had burned through what little money she had saved, then borrowed from friends who gradually stopped answering her calls as the amounts grew larger and the prospects of repayment grew dimmer. Her mother had passed away on a Tuesday morning in February, the snow falling softly outside the hospice window, her hand warm in Liliana's grip until suddenly it wasn't. After that, the dominoes had fallen with cruel efficiency. The landlord, who had been patient during her mother's illness, finally ran out of patience. 3 months behind on rent, then 4. The eviction notice had been delivered on a Monday. Her belongings had been on the street by Friday. She had tried to find work, but potential employers wanted addresses, references, phone numbers that didn't exist anymore. The shelters were overcrowded, their beds claimed by others who had arrived first or had better connections, or simply better luck. One night on the street had become a week. A week had become a month. A month had become 3 years. A sharp rap on the car window jolted Liliana back to the present. Her eyes snapped open, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see the sedan's driver staring at her with an expression of shock and anger. Behind him, both Elliot Morse and Harlan Reed had turned to look, their important conversation interrupted by the discovery of an intruder. Panic flooded through her. She had known this was a risk, had known she might get caught, but the reality of it was far more terrifying than the abstract possibility. These were not the kind of people who showed mercy to someone like her. She scrambled for the door handle, her fingers clumsy with renewed fear and the lingering effects of the cold. The door was yanked open from outside, and suddenly she was face to face with Reed's driver, a man in his 30s whose face had gone red with indignation. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. Liliana stumbled out of the car, nearly losing her balance on the slick pavement. The cold hit her immediately, all the warmth she had borrowed vanishing in an instant. "I'm sorry," she managed, her voice hoarse from disuse and shame. "I'm so sorry. I was just trying to get out of the rain. I wasn't trying to cause any trouble. I'll go. I'm sorry." The words tumbled out in a rush. The apology she had perfected over years of existing in spaces where she wasn't wanted. She kept her head down, her posture submissive, every line of her body language screaming that she was not a threat, that she would disappear if they just let her. But Elliot Morse was already striding toward them, his expensive shoes splashing through puddles without regard, his face a mask of outrage. Marcus had abandoned the umbrella to follow his employer, leaving both men exposed to the downpour, but Elliot didn't seem to notice or care. His attention was fixed entirely on the bedraggled woman who had dared to interrupt his billion-dollar meeting. "What is this?" Elliot's voice was sharp, each word precisely enunciated and dripping with disdain. He came to a stop a few feet away, close enough to make his presence felt but far enough to maintain a physical barrier between himself and someone he clearly viewed as contaminated. "Who are you? What were you doing in Mr. Reed's vehicle?" Liliana forced herself to meet his eyes, years of her mother's lessons about dignity warring with the instinct to simply run. "I'm sorry, sir. My name is Lilliana Good. I was just trying to get warm. I didn't touch anything, I didn't take anything, I was just sitting in there for a minute. I'm leaving now." She turned to go, to escape back into the rain and the shadows where she belonged, but she had taken only one step when her worn sneaker caught on the uneven pavement. She pitched forward, her arms windmilling for balance, and reached out instinctively to steady herself. Her hand found purchase on the sedan's door frame, her fingers gripping the cold metal to keep from falling face first onto the wet street. But in steadying herself, her sleeve, soaked and grimy from months of wear without proper washing, brushed against the sedan's glossy black door. It left a faint streak, barely visible in the dim light but unmistakable once you noticed it. A smear of dirt and rainwater marring the perfect finish of a vehicle that probably cost more than she had earned in her entire lifetime. The world seemed to freeze. Elliot's eyes fixed on that streak with the intensity of a predator spotting wounded prey. His face underwent a transformation, shock giving way to something darker, something that made Liliana's stomach clench with fear. He stared at the mark as if it were a mortal wound, as if she had desecrated something sacred rather than merely touched a car door. "Did you just—" Elliot's voice was barely above a whisper, but there was something in it that was far more threatening than shouting would have been. "Did you just put your filthy hands on this vehicle?" Lightning split the sky overhead, illuminating the scene in harsh, white light. In that frozen moment, Lilliana could see everything with perfect clarity. The fury building in Elliot's expression, the curious interest on Harlan Reed's face as he watched from several feet away with his arms crossed, the uncertain stance of Reed's driver who seemed unsure whether he should intervene or wait for instructions, the anxiety on Marcus's weathered features. Thunder boomed immediately after, so loud it felt like the earth itself was protesting what was about to unfold. "I'm so sorry," Lilliana said quickly, desperately. She reached toward the door with her other sleeve, trying to wipe away the mark she had left, to undo the damage, to make herself invisible again. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying not to fall. Please, I can clean it off, I'm sorry." But her attempt to fix the situation only made it worse. Her effort to wipe the door spread the smudge, making it larger, more obvious. The wet fabric of her sleeve left additional marks, turning one small blemish into several. She was making it worse with every motion, her desperation transforming a minor incident into something that looked like deliberate vandalism. "Stop." Elliot's command cracked through the air like a whip. "Stop touching it. You're making it worse, you filthy." He caught himself, biting back whatever word had been about to follow. But the damage was already done. The venom in his voice was unmistakable, the disgust so palpable it felt like a physical presence in the rain-soaked air. He looked at Lilliana not as a person but as something beneath personhood, an object that had dared to enter his sphere and contaminate it with its presence. Lilliana pulled her hands back as if she had been burned, clasping them together in front of her chest. She was shaking again, but no longer from the cold. This was the bone-deep fear that came from recognizing genuine danger, from understanding that she had somehow triggered something in this man that went beyond mere annoyance or inconvenience. "Do you have any idea," Elliot continued, his voice rising now, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact, "how much that vehicle costs? Do you have any conception of value? Of property? Of respecting things that don't belong to you?" The rain continued to pour down on all of them, but it might as well have not existed. All of Elliot's attention was focused on Lilliana, his anger finding a target that was convenient, that was vulnerable, that couldn't fight back. "I didn't mean any harm," Lilliana said quietly, her voice nearly lost beneath the storm. "I'm sorry. I'll go." But Elliot wasn't finished. He took a step closer and Lilliana instinctively took a step back, her shoes splashing in a puddle. "Sorry? You're sorry?" His laugh was harsh and humorless. "You come crawling into someone else's property like some kind of animal, and you think sorry makes it acceptable?" "Elliot," Harlan Reed's voice cut through the tension, mild but carrying a note of caution. He had moved closer, his expression one of faint amusement, mixed with something that might have been curiosity. "It's just a car door. My driver can have it cleaned in 5 minutes." But if Reed intended his words to defuse the situation, they had the opposite effect. Elliot whirled on him, his face flushed with anger that seemed wildly disproportionate to the circumstances. "That's not the point, Harlan. The point is respect. The point is that people need to know their place. The point is that someone like this," he gestured at Lilliana without looking at her, as if even acknowledging her directly was beneath him, "has no business existing in the same space as people like us." The words hung in the air, ugly and raw. Reed's eyebrows rose slightly, his mild smile fading into an expression that was harder to read. His driver shifted uncomfortably, and even Marcus looked away, clearly disturbed by his employer's vehemence. Lilliana felt something crack inside her chest. She had endured so much over the past 3 years, had absorbed countless insults and dismissals and moments of casual cruelty from a world that had decided she no longer mattered. But there was something about the way Elliot said those words, something about the particular flavor of his contempt, that cut deeper than usual. "I exist whether you acknowledge it or not," she heard herself say, the words emerging before she could stop them, her mother's voice echoing in her memory about standing tall and claiming her own size. Elliot's head snapped around, his eyes widening in disbelief that she had dared to speak. The rain pounded down harder, as if the storm itself was building towards some inevitable crescendo. And in that moment, with water streaming down all their faces and thunder rolling overhead and years of anger and pain and injustice crystallizing into this single point in time, something fundamental shifted. The confrontation that had begun as a minor interruption, a simple misunderstanding that could have been resolved with a few words and a moment's patience, had transformed into something far more dangerous. The seeds had been planted, the words had been spoken, and there was no taking any of it back. Elliot's face contorted with rage, the carefully constructed mask of the powerful CEO cracking to reveal something uglier beneath. The rain seemed to intensify around him, as if nature itself was responding to the darkness emerging from this man who believed he controlled everything he touched. His voice, when it came, was no longer the controlled tone of dismissive contempt, but a bellow that cut through the storm like a blade. "How dare you speak to me?" The words exploded from him with such force that Marcus actually flinched, taking an involuntary step backward. "You types always destroy everything you touch. Everything. You can't be trusted with anything of value because you don't understand value. You don't understand ownership. You don't understand that there are standards in this world that separate civilization from chaos." The volume of his tirade caused ripples to spread across the puddles surrounding them, the water disturbed by the sheer force of his fury. A homeless man who had been shuffling past on the opposite side of the street stopped in his tracks, his shopping cart squeaking to a halt as he turned to stare at the scene unfolding. Two women hurrying by under a shared umbrella slowed their pace, their faces reflecting shock and something that looked like horrified fascination. Reed's driver, still standing beside the sedan, went rigid. His hand, which had been resting casually on the car's roof, slowly dropped to his side. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darted between Elliot and Lilliana, and then to his employer, clearly seeking some guidance on how to respond to what was happening. But Harlan Reed remained motionless, his expression unreadable behind the curtain of rain, watching with the intensity of someone witnessing something significant. Lightning flashed again, closer now, illuminating the entire street in stark clarity. In that frozen moment of brightness, every detail became hypervisible, the fury twisting Elliot's features, the water streaming down Liliana's face, mixing with what might have been tears, the shock on Marcus's weathered face, the calculation in Harlan Reed's eyes. "You people have no concept of responsibility," Elliot continued, his voice still raised but taking on a different quality now, something more insidious than simple anger. "No understanding of how society functions. Animals are cleaner than you. At least animals know their territory and stay in it. But you wander into places you don't belong, touching things you have no right to touch, existing in spaces that weren't meant for you." The words echoed through the narrow street, bouncing off the wet brick walls and seeming to multiply in their ugliness. A car passing on the main road slowed, its driver craning his neck to see what was causing the commotion. The homeless man with the shopping cart made a quick sign of the cross and hurried away, wheels squeaking frantically as if he feared proximity to such venom might somehow contaminate him as well. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud and so close that several car alarms on nearby streets began wailing in response. But the sound seemed distant compared to the roaring in Liliana's ears, the rush of blood and shame and fury that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Her hands, hanging at her sides, slowly curled into fists. Her fingernails, broken and dirty from years of survival on the streets, dug into her palms hard enough to hurt. Every instinct screamed at her to respond, to fight back, to tell this man exactly what he was and what he represented. The words were there, crowding her throat, demanding release. She wanted to shout that his money didn't make him better than her, that his suits and cars and deals meant nothing when measured against basic human decency, that he was the animal here, the one who had forgotten what it meant to be human. But she didn't. Instead, she stood there in the pouring rain, her soaked clothing clinging to her thin frame, her body shaking from cold and emotion and 3 years of accumulated indignity. She lifted her chin slowly, deliberately, the gesture her mother had taught her decades ago. "Stand tall, Lily." The world will try to make you small, but you get to decide your own size. Margaret Good had never met Elliot Morse, had never encountered someone with this particular brand of casual cruelty backed by institutional power and wealth. But she had known men like him, had encountered people who believed that poverty was a moral failing and that suffering was something the sufferers had somehow earned. She had taught her daughter that maintaining dignity in the face of such people was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. So Lilliana stood tall. She unclenched her fists, forced her breathing to slow, and met Elliot's eyes directly. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, each word carefully chosen and delivered with a composure that seemed to surprise even her. "I am sorry for touching your associate's car," she said, pronouncing each syllable with precision. "That was not my intention. But I am not sorry for existing, and I will not apologize for seeking shelter from a storm. My circumstances do not define my worth as a human being, regardless of what you believe." The simple statement, delivered with such quiet dignity, seemed to hit Elliot harder than any shouted response could have. His face flushed an even deeper red, and for a moment he appeared genuinely speechless, as if the idea that this woman might possess self-respect was so foreign to his worldview that he couldn't immediately process it. But while Elliot sputtered, searching for his next verbal assault, something else was happening that he was too consumed by his own rage to notice. Harlan Reed had shifted his attention entirely away from Lilliana. He was no longer looking at the smudged car door, no longer examining the woman who had caused this disruption. Instead, his gaze was fixed completely on Elliot Morse. Reed's expression had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. The mild amusement that had flickered across his face at the beginning of this encounter had vanished entirely. His eyes, sharp and analytical behind the rain-streaked lenses of his glasses, tracked every micro-expression on Elliot's face, catalogued every word, weighed every gesture. He watched the way Elliot's hands clenched and unclenched, the way spittle flew from his mouth when he shouted, the way he seemed to grow larger and more aggressive with each passing second. Reed saw something in that moment that Elliot was too blind to recognize. He saw not a powerful CEO defending his standards and values, but a man whose mask had slipped, revealing the rot beneath. He saw someone who measured human worth in dollars and square footage and the ability to avoid leaving smudges on car doors. He saw cruelty that was not incidental or reactive but fundamental, woven into the very fabric of who Elliot Morse was. The investor's face remained carefully neutral, but anyone who knew him well would have recognized the subtle tightening around his eyes, the slight press of his lips, the microscopic shift in his posture. These were the tells that appeared when Harlan Reed was reconsidering everything he thought he knew about a situation. Elliot, oblivious to this scrutiny, seemed to decide that he had wasted enough time on someone so far beneath his notice. He turned away from Lilliana with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if physically brushing her existence aside. His shoes splashed through puddles as he moved back toward Harlan Reed, his anger already transforming into the smooth confidence he wore like armor in business dealings. "Harlan, I apologize for that interruption," Elliot said, his voice already returning to its usual modulated tone, though an edge of his previous venom still lingered beneath the surface. "Where were we?" Yes, the merger. As I was saying, with your capital injection of $1 billion, we'll be positioned to acquire TechWave Industries within the quarter. Their AI division alone is worth twice what they're currently valued at, and once we strip away the dead weight in their management. He continued talking, falling easily back into the practiced rhythm of his sales pitch, gesturing with his hands to emphasize key points, his body language open and confident. In his mind, the incident with the homeless woman was already categorized and filed away as a minor annoyance, an unfortunate interruption that had been dealt with and could now be forgotten. He had handled it, put the woman in her place, demonstrated his standards and expectations. Now it was time to return to what actually mattered: the deal, the expansion, the empire. Behind him, Lilliana remained standing in the rain, watching this man who had just verbally eviscerated her now pivot seamlessly back to discussing billions as if nothing significant had occurred. She saw Marcus approach her cautiously, his weathered face creased with an emotion that might have been sympathy or shame or both. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a $20 bill, holding it out to her with eyes that couldn't quite meet hers. "Miss," he said quietly, his voice barely audible beneath the rain and his employer's enthusiastic pitch. "Please, take this and go somewhere dry. I'm sorry." Lilliana looked at the money, then at Marcus's conflicted face, then back at the money. She understood what he was offering. Not just $20, but absolution, a way for him to feel slightly less complicit in what had just happened. She also understood that refusing it would be foolish pride she couldn't afford. $20 meant food, meant a night in a shelter, if she could find space, meant survival. She took the bill with a small nod of acknowledgement, then turned and walked away, her footsteps splashing through puddles that reflected the streetlights like broken mirrors. She didn't look back at the 2 luxury cars or the men conducting their important business or the scene of her humiliation. She simply walked, her chin still held high despite everything, because that was what her mother had taught her to do. Back at the sedan, Elliot had moved into the details of the merger timeline, discussing quarterly projections and market analysis with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was seconds away from closing the deal of his career. His hands carved shapes in the air, illustrating growth trajectories and market penetration strategies. Rain continued to pour down on him, but he seemed almost energized by it now, his earlier fury transmuted into the aggressive confidence that had built his empire. By Q3 next year, we'll have consolidated operations across 17 countries, Elliot continued, his voice rising with excitement. The regulatory approvals are already in motion, and I have personal relationships with the key decision-makers in every relevant jurisdiction. This isn't speculation, Harlan. This is inevitability. All it needs is your capital to make it happen. He paused, waiting for Reed's response, expecting enthusiasm or at least engaged interest. The pitch had been flawless. The numbers were undeniable. The opportunity was exactly the kind of high-return, low-risk investment that Reed built his fortune pursuing. Everything was aligned perfectly. But Harlan Reed said nothing. The investor stood in the rain, his driver still dutifully holding the umbrella over his head, his expensive suit somehow remaining immaculate despite the downpour. His hands remained in his pockets, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He looked at Elliot with an expression that was becoming increasingly difficult to interpret, a blankness that seemed to contain multitudes. The silence stretched out, growing heavier with each passing second. Thunder rumbled in the distance, the storm beginning to move away, but leaving behind a steady, relentless rain that showed no signs of stopping. A gust of wind sent water cascading from nearby awnings, creating small waterfalls that added to the ambient noise of the storm. Elliot's confident expression began to falter. His hands, which had been gesturing expansively, slowly lowered to his sides. "Harlan," he prompted, an uncertain note creeping into his voice for the first time that evening. "What do you think? Are we ready to move forward with the terms we discussed?" Still, Reed said nothing. He simply stared at Elliot Morse, his silence somehow more devastating than any words could have been. The temperature seemed to drop, though whether that was the storm or something else entirely was impossible to say. Marcus, standing a few feet away beside the limousine, felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. The deal that had seemed certain minutes ago now hung in the balance, suspended in the icy void of Harlan Reed's silence. And Elliot Morse, who prided himself on reading people and situations, on controlling every variable and anticipating every outcome, finally began to understand that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The moment stretched out like a wire-pulled taut, ready to snap. The rain continued its relentless assault on the street, each drop hitting the pavement with a percussion that seemed to count down to something inevitable, something that could not be stopped or reversed. Elliot stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his practiced pitch dying on his lips as he searched Harlan Reed's face for some sign of what was happening behind those calculating eyes. Marcus felt it too, that shift in the air that preceded disaster. He had worked for Elliot Morse long enough to recognize when his employer was losing control of a situation, and the old driver's instincts were screaming warnings that something fundamental had broken in the carefully constructed evening. He took a small step backward, as if proximity to the impending collapse might somehow make him complicit in it. Reed's driver maintained his position with the umbrella, but his posture had changed as well. He stood straighter, more alert, as if recognizing that his employer was about to do something significant and wanting to bear witness to it properly. The rain drummed against the umbrella's fabric, a steady rhythm that seemed to mark time in a way that made every second feel longer than it should. Finally, after what felt like an eternity compressed into perhaps 30 seconds, Harlan Reed spoke. His voice was quiet, conversational even, but there was steel underneath it, a core of absolute certainty that made every word land with the weight of a judge's gavel. "Tell me something, Elliot," Reed began, his hands still in his pockets, his posture relaxed in a way that somehow made him seem more dangerous rather than less. "How do you treat people when you think no one important is watching?" The question hung in the rain-soaked air between them. Elliot blinked, thrown off balance by the seemingly random inquiry. This wasn't the response he had expected. Reed should have been asking about return on investment, about timeline and implementation strategy, about the specifics of the TechWave acquisition. Instead, he was asking about something that seemed entirely disconnected from business. But Reed had already moved on. He scanned the street, looking for something, and then his gaze settled on a figure about half a block away. Lilliana had taken shelter under the awning of an abandoned storefront, her arms wrapped around herself, Marcus's $20 bill clutched in one hand. She was watching the scene unfold with an expression that mixed disbelief with something that might have been vindication or justice or simply exhausted recognition that sometimes, very rarely, the universe balanced its scales. Reed walked toward her, leaving his driver and the sedan behind. His stride was purposeful but not aggressive, his body language open and non-threatening. Elliot watched this happen with a growing sense of horror, understanding that he was about to be humiliated even further, but unable to think of any way to prevent it. When Reed reached Lilliana, he stopped a respectful distance away, not invading her space but close enough to speak without shouting. The rain continued to pour down on both of them, but Reed seemed oblivious to it, focused entirely on the woman before him. "Nam," he said, and his voice was gentle now, stripped of the steel it had contained moments earlier. "I want to apologize for what you experienced tonight. No one should be spoken to the way that man spoke to you. No one should be made to feel less than human because of their circumstances." Lilliana stared at him, clearly uncertain how to respond to this bizarre turn of events. Her eyes were wide, still processing everything that had happened in the last few minutes. Reed reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted not one bill but several, a thick sheaf that he held out to her with both hands, as if offering something precious. "This won't solve your problems, I know that. But it might help you get somewhere dry, get a hot meal, maybe a few nights in a decent place. You deserve that much at least." Lilliana looked at the money, then at Reed's face, searching for mockery or condescension or pity. But what she found there was simply respect, one human being acknowledging another as an equal regardless of their material circumstances. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out and took the bills. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was thick with emotion she was struggling to contain. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for seeing me." Reed nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "You're welcome. And for what it's worth, you handled that situation with more grace and dignity than many people in your position would have managed. Your mother raised you well." The mention of her mother made Lilliana's eyes well up with tears that mixed with the rain on her face. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Reed turned and walked back to his sedan, where his driver stood waiting with patient professionalism. He climbed into the back seat without looking at Elliot Morse again, without acknowledging the man who had been so certain of his investment just 20 minutes earlier. The driver closed the door, folded the umbrella, and got behind the wheel. The sedan's engine purred to life, and moments later it pulled away from the curb, its taillights disappearing into the rain-soaked night. Elliot stood alone in the middle of the street, water pooling around his expensive shoes. His billion-dollar deal vanished like smoke. His carefully constructed evening collapsed into rubble around him. His entire body quivered with a fury so intense it was almost incandescent. Rage mixed with humiliation mixed with the dawning realization that this moment would follow him, that Reed would tell others, that his reputation would suffer in ways he couldn't yet fully calculate. Marcus approached cautiously, holding out the umbrella that had been abandoned earlier. "Sir," he said quietly, "perhaps we should go." But Elliot didn't move. He simply stood there in the rain, shaking with anger, staring at the spot where Harlan Reed's sedan had been, unable to process how completely his world had just shifted on its axis. The storm continued to rage around him, but the real tempest was inside him, a maelstrom of wounded pride and thwarted ambition and the terrible knowledge that he had done this to himself. Elliot stood there, the rain hammering down like judgment from above, his coat clinging to him in heavy folds. His face twisted, veins pulsing at his temples as Harlan's footsteps faded into the night. The investor's words still rang in his ears, a public execution carried out in the deluge. Quivering with a mix of fury and the first sharp stab of dread, Elliot turned his gaze to Lilliana. She lingered a few paces away, her figure small against the storm, yet unbowed, her eyes steady despite the water streaming down her face. In that moment, she became the target for all his unraveling rage. "Do you grasp what you cost me?" Elliot yelled, his voice cracking over the thunderous downpour. He lunged a step closer, pointing a trembling finger at her, as if she alone had orchestrated the disaster. "That was a billion-dollar handshake you just ruined with your pathetic intrusion. You and your kind. Always leeching, always in the way." The words spilled out, raw and unchecked, fueled by the humiliation burning in his chest. Lilliana didn't flinch, though her hands tightened at her sides. She had faced worse on these streets, colder nights and harsher dismissals, but this venom carried a personal edge that stung deeper than the rain. The driver, a stoic man named Victor who had served Elliot for 5 years without complaint, emerged from the shadows beside the idling vehicle. He had witnessed the entire exchange, his expression shifting from neutral professionalism to something harder, more resolute. Victor adjusted his cap, water dripping from its brim, and stepped between them. "Mr. Morse," he stated evenly, his voice cutting through the storm with quiet authority. "Time to go." There was no deference in his tone now, no sir or please, just a flat declaration that hung in the air like a challenge. Elliot whirled on him, eyes wild. "Go? You think you can order me around? Get in the car and drive me out of this mess." He jabbed a finger toward the open door, expecting obedience as he always had. But Victor didn't move. Instead, he met Elliot's glare head-on, the rain pattering off his shoulders. "Not this vehicle," Victor countered, his words measured but firm. "And not our honor." The statement landed like a blow, simple yet devastating. Victor had seen enough. Years of Elliot's tirades behind closed doors, the casual dismissals of staff, the entitlement that eroded respect. This night, in the open fury of the storm, had been the breaking point. His motivation was clear, a line drawn not just for Lilliana, but for his own sense of right, a quiet rebellion against serving a man who trampled others without remorse. Thrilling tension crackled in the air as Victor turned to Lilliana, extending a hand. "Ma'am, please," he said gently, gesturing to the back seat. "Let me get you out of this weather." Lilliana hesitated, surprise flickering across her features, but the offer was genuine, a rare spark of solidarity in her world of isolation. She nodded, stepping forward as Victor opened the door wider, shielding her from the worst of the gusts. Elliot exploded. "What are you doing?" "That's my car. You work for me." He rushed forward, grabbing at Victor's arm, but the driver shrugged him off with surprising strength, the action swift and unyielding. The scuffle was brief but charged, Elliot slipping on the slick pavement, his expensive shoes no match for the flooded ground, while Victor held firm, his years of navigating city chaos giving him the edge. Lilliana slid into the back seat, the warmth of the interior enveloping her like a forgotten comfort. She sank into the leather, her soaked clothes dripping onto the floor, but for the first time that night, a quiet relief washed over her. The car smelled of polish and privilege, a stark contrast to the shelters she knew, and as Victor closed the door behind her, she allowed herself a deep breath. No more exposure to the elements, no more bearing the weight of Elliot's scorn alone. Her thoughts turned inward, to the kin she supported from afar, the odd jobs that kept her afloat, and in this unexpected sanctuary, she felt a glimmer of validation, as if the universe had finally tilted in her favor. Victor rounded to the driver's side, ignoring Elliot's continued shouts. "You're fired. You'll never work again." Elliot bellowed, but his threats dissolved in the roar of the engine as Victor started the car. The headlights flared, cutting through the sheets of rain, and with a smooth acceleration, the vehicle pulled away from the curb. Elliot lunged after it, his hands slapping uselessly against the rear window, but it was gone, taillights fading into the haze. Stranded now, truly alone in the downpour, Elliot spun around, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He realized then, the street wasn't empty. Pedestrians under umbrellas had paused, their faces illuminated by phone screens as they recorded the spectacle. Scorn etched their expressions, whispers carrying over the wind. "That's him, the CEO who just blew up." The weight of their judgment hit harder than the rain, a public stripping of his facade. He fled, stumbling down the wet pavement, ranting at the elements as if they conspired against him. "This isn't over. I'll crush them all," he shouted to the empty night, but his voice echoed hollow, drowned by thunder. Water seeped into his socks, his coat a sodden burden, mirroring the collapse beginning inside him. Back in the car, Lilliana watched the city blur past, her quiet relief deepening. Victor glanced in the rearview mirror. "Where to, ma'am? A shelter? Somewhere safe." She gave directions to a nearby center, her voice steady, gratitude unspoken but evident. For her, this was more than a ride. It was a momentary reclaiming of humanity, a shield against the storm both literal and figurative. The flash forward came swift, as news traveled faster than the rain could fall. By morning, headlines erupted across finance outlets. Harlan Reed pulls $1 billion investment after CEO's bigoted tirade on street. Screens lit up with amateur videos of the confrontation, the slur amplified in loops, sparking outrage. Stocks dove 52% in pre-market trading, wiping out billions in value. Directors convened emergency calls, mulling ouster amid the scandal's blaze. Backers fled, emails retracting support, partnerships dissolving like mist. Elliot, holed up in his office, stared at the plummeting charts, his internal panic a whirlwind. How had one rainy encounter unraveled everything? He paced, dialing contacts who now ghosted him, the dread coiling tighter. Motivations clarified in his mind, not just Harlan's ethics, but the driver's long-simmering resentment, the public's swift verdict. No confusion lingered. The outcomes were stark, irreversible. Meanwhile, in the car that night, Liliana's relief solidified into something profound. She had faced the outburst without crumbling, her composure a quiet armor. Victor dropped her at the shelter, refusing any thanks, his own satisfaction in the act evident. As she stepped inside, drying off, she reflected on the night's chaos, not with bitterness, but with a sense of closure. The motivations were clear. Harlan's stand for decency, the driver's for integrity, her own for enduring with head held high. Outcomes unfolded without ambiguity. Elliot's empire cracking, her path subtly altered by an unexpected ally. The storm outside raged on, but inside, a calm settled, the first in a long chain of shifts. Elliot's panic deepened as the hours ticked by. He slammed his phone down after another unanswered call, the reality sinking in. This wasn't a minor setback. The tirade had gone viral, forums dissecting his words, analysts predicting further dives. Directors texted demands for explanations, their tones laced with distance. He had always prided himself on control, but now it slipped away, eroded by his own hubris. In contrast, Liliana, settling into a cot at the shelter, allowed herself a small smile. The relief lingered, a buffer against the cold. She thought of her kin, how this night might ripple outward, though she couldn't yet see how. Victor, driving home, felt no regret, his choice rooted in years of observing Elliot's disdain, culminating in that rainy refusal. The outcomes aligned, justice in motion, no threads left dangling. As dawn broke, the initial fallout intensified. Stocks stabilized briefly but trended downward, investors citing reputational risk. Backers who had pledged millions withdrew, citing ethical misalignment. Staff emails flooded HR with resignations, morale shattered by the exposure. Elliot's internal turmoil peaked. He replayed the scene, questioning if a softer word could have salvaged it, but denial gave way to fear. Lilliana, waking to the news on a shared screen, felt validated, her relief evolving into quiet strength. The motivations, Harlan's principles, the driver's conscience, her resilience, wove a clear tapestry. No confusion clouded the path ahead. The night had set irreversible courses, dignity emerging unscathed while arrogance drowned in the flood. As the gray light of dawn filtered through the city, the fallout from that stormy night accelerated like a freight train gaining speed. Elliot Morse, once the untouchable architect of a vast conglomerate, now paced the confines of his high-rise office, the skyline outside mocking his descent. The stocks, after a fleeting attempt at stability, resumed their plunge, shedding value with each passing hour. Investors, who had once clamored for a piece of his vision, now distanced themselves, their statements citing not just financial prudence, but a moral reckoning with the man at the helm. Backers who had pledged fortunes withdrew in droves, their emails terse and final, severing ties that had been forged over years of calculated alliances. Staff, too, began to abandon ship, resignations pouring into human resources like a digital exodus, entire departments fracturing under the weight of the scandal. Elliot's realm, built on intimidation and unyielding control, shook at its foundations, cracks spiderwebbing through operations he could no longer command. He slammed a fist on his desk, the sound echoing in the empty space. Phones rang unanswered, screens flickered with alerts of plunging metrics, and emails piled up like accusations. Allies who had once bent to his will now ghosted his calls, their silence a damning verdict. One by one, suppliers renegotiated terms unfavorably, partners invoked exit clauses, and clients shifted loyalties to competitors. The operations that had run like clockwork, global supply chains, innovative divisions, lucrative contracts, ground to a halt, paralyzed by the vacuum of leadership. Elliot tried to rally, barking orders into voicemails, but his voice carried no weight anymore, drowned out by the chorus of disapproval echoing across networks. Flashbacks assaulted him in waves, pulling him back to his ruthless beginnings. He remembered the early days, scraping through a modest upbringing in a forgotten industrial town, where survival meant outmaneuvering everyone. As a young entrepreneur, he had clawed his way up by undercutting rivals, exploiting loopholes, and demanding absolute loyalty from those around him. One memory stood sharp, a deal in his 20s, where he had berated a junior partner into submission over a minor error, watching the man crumble and quit, only to absorb his ideas as his own. That moment had tasted like victory, reinforcing his belief that power came from fear, not fairness. Another flash, rising through corporate ranks by leaking a colleague's mistake to superiors, stepping over the fallout to claim a promotion. These acts had built his arrogance, layer by layer, convincing him that vulnerability was weakness and dominance the only path to success. They explained his snap judgments, his quick dismissals, without ever excusing them, each choice a thread in the tapestry of power abuse that now unraveled before him. In stark contrast, Lilliana Good navigated the aftermath from the humble confines of the shelter, a converted warehouse on the city's edge, where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and cots lined the walls like silent sentinels. She sat on the edge of her bed, a thin blanket draped over her shoulders, reflecting on the emotional toll of the previous night. The encounter had left invisible bruises, the sting of being reduced to less than human, the echo of that slur cutting deeper than any chill. Yet, her dignity remained intact, a fortress she had fortified through years of adversity. She thought of the faces in the rain, the driver's unexpected kindness, Harlan's quiet solidarity, and how her composure had held firm, a quiet act of resistance. It hadn't been easy. Tremors of anger and hurt lingered, but they didn't define her. Instead, they fueled a resolve to press on, to continue scraping together what she could for her kin far away, reminders of why she endured. Supporting elements amplified the chaos for Elliot. Board members, once pliant under his influence, now convened virtual meetings without him. Their discussions leaked through anonymous channels. One director, a longtime associate named Elena Vargas, led the charge, her emails circulating evidence of past indiscretions unearthed by the scandal's spotlight. Media scrutiny turned the incident into a blaze, outlets dissecting every angle, the viral videos captured by those pedestrians, analysts debating the conglomerate's future, opinion pieces branding Elliot a relic of toxic leadership. Reporters camped outside his building, their questions shouted like indictments, forcing him into seclusion. The amplification was relentless, each article and segment peeling back layers of his carefully curated image, exposing the rot beneath. Thriller suspense built as Elliot attempted damage control, his efforts frantic and futile. He dialed Harlan first, the line ringing endlessly before voicemail kicked in, his pleas for reconsideration falling into the void. Next, he reached out to key investors, scripting apologies that rang hollow even to him, but responses came as curt rejections or silence. One call connected briefly, a major backer named Diego Ruiz, who listened for a moment before cutting in. "Your words last night? They speak louder than any pitch. We're out." The line went dead, leaving Elliot staring at the phone, his illusion of invincibility shattering like glass underfoot. He tried public relations firms, offering exorbitant fees for spin, but even they hesitated, wary of associating with the toxicity. As the day wore on, he paced faster, sweat beading despite the air conditioning, realizing the empire he had built was a house of cards, toppled by one gust of truth. The suspense peaked in his mind. Would the board act tonight? Could he salvage anything? Each unanswered query heightening the dread. Lilliana, meanwhile, moved through her morning routine at the shelter with a measured calm. She helped distribute breakfast trays, her hands steady as she poured coffee for others, the simple acts grounding her amid the lingering emotional echoes. The news played on a communal television, reporters recounting the tirade, and she watched without surprise, her unbroken dignity a quiet counterpoint to Elliot's frenzy. It wasn't vengeance she felt, but a subtle affirmation that standing tall, even in the storm, mattered. The emotional toll weighed on her. Nights like these reminded her of the world's inequities, but her resilience shone through, a light undimmed. Elliot's internal panic evolved into a full storm as more reports flooded in. A press release from Harlan's firm confirmed the withdrawal, citing ethical incompatibility, sending another wave through the markets. Directors escalated their pressure, scheduling a vote for his removal, their communications bypassing him entirely. He attempted one last call to a loyalist on the board, but the response was chilling. "It's over, Elliot. Your actions have consequences." The realization hit. He wasn't invincible. He never had been. The thriller of his downfall played out in real time, suspense giving way to inevitability. At the shelter, as afternoon light slanted through narrow windows, Lilliana returned from a brief errand to find an envelope waiting at the front desk, her name scrawled in neat script. Curiosity piqued. She opened it carefully, unfolding a note and a bank draft. The words leaped out. "Lilliana, you met malice with strength. I admire that profoundly. This isn't pity. It's acknowledgement." Harlan. The draft amounted to $100,000, enough to secure stable housing, to send support to her kin, to begin reshaping a path long denied her. She pressed the paper to her chest, a wave of possibility washing over her, acknowledging not just the funds, but the recognition of her worth. In that moment, amid the shelter's hum, her strength felt seen, a quiet victory in the empire's crumble. Elliot, oblivious to this parallel uplift, sank into a chair as evening approached, the office lights harsh against his defeat. Flashbacks resurfaced, deals won through manipulation, rivals crushed without remorse, each one now a mirror to his arrogance. The board's decision loomed, allies gone, operations in disarray. Staff continued to quit, emails citing the video as the final straw. Morale evaporated. Media piled on, interviews with former employees surfacing old grievances, amplifying the incident into a movement against unchecked power. Lilliana, envelope in hand, stepped outside the shelter, the rain finally easing. She reflected once more. The toll had been real, the hurt lingering like a bruise, but her dignity endured, unbroken and brighter. The contrast was stark, Elliot's world fracturing under self-inflicted wounds, hers opening to new horizons. As she walked, planning her next steps, the city's rhythm felt less hostile, her poise a beacon. Suspense lingered for Elliot as he awaited the board's call, but deep down, he knew the end neared. His attempts at control had failed, the illusion shattered. In the quiet of his office, he replayed not just the night, but his life, the ruthless climb that led here. No excuses held. The abuse of power had caught up, tying back to every slight, every dominance asserted. At the shelter, Lilliana shared the news with a trusted friend, the envelope a symbol of shift. The emotional toll faded slightly, replaced by hope. Her kin would benefit, her path cleared, all without compromising her core. Harlan's gesture acknowledged what Elliot never could, her inherent value. The chapter closed on Elliot's shaking realm, allies fully severed, staff departed, operations stalled. Board pressure mounted, media unrelenting. Thriller elements peaked in his vain pleas, the realization dawning. Invincibility was myth. Lilliana, finding the envelope, embodied the counter, strength rewarded, dignity affirmed. With the envelope clutched tightly in her hand, Lilliana stepped out of the shelter into the crisp air of the following day, the storm's remnants glistening on the pavement like scattered diamonds. The city hummed around her, indifferent as ever, but something inside had shifted. The $100,000 draft from Harlan Reed wasn't just paper. It was a lifeline, a validation she hadn't sought but deeply needed. She strolled along the familiar sidewalks, her steps lighter than they had been in years, the weight of constant survival easing for the first time. Acknowledged, valued, alive, these sensations bloomed within her, warming against the chill of past struggles. For ages, she had navigated the edges of society, invisible to most, but now she felt seen, her fortitude not just a private armor, but a force recognized by someone with the means to change trajectories. The funds opened doors she had long assumed locked. First, housing, a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, nothing lavish, but stable walls and a door she could call her own. No more cots in crowded rooms or nights exposed to the elements. She wired a portion to her kin, distant relatives relying on her sporadic support, ensuring they could cover essentials like medical bills and schooling. The rest she set aside for a fresh start, vocational training, perhaps in community services, where her experiences could help others facing similar hardships. Pride remained intact. This wasn't handouts eroding her self-reliance, but acknowledgement fueling it. As she walked, envelope tucked safely in her pocket, the city seemed less daunting, her path forward illuminated by possibility rather than peril. Interwoven with Lilliana's quiet ascent was Harlan Reed's own history, a narrative of ethical ascent that explained his unflinching stand in the rain. Harlan hadn't always been the sharp-minded investor commanding billions. He rose from modest roots in a coastal town, where his parents ran a small fishery, teaching him the value of fair dealings and human connection. Early in his career as a junior analyst, he witnessed a superior exploit workers for profit, a betrayal that cost livelihoods and haunted him. Vowing never to replicate such callousness, Harlan built his portfolio on principles, investing in companies that prioritized people over pure gain. One pivotal deal in his 30s involved pulling support from a promising tech firm after uncovering labor abuses, a move that initially drew criticism but ultimately boosted his reputation as a moral compass in cutthroat finance. This backstory fueled his decisive rejection of Elliot. It was an impulse, but a lifetime of valuing integrity, seeing in Lilliana's poise the same quiet strength his parents had instilled in him. His stand wasn't just about one night. It was a continuation of a career defined by lifting others, explaining why he acted without hesitation, his motivations rooted in empathy forged from personal observation. Thriller elements persisted in Elliot's world, where desperation morphed into frantic schemes to salvage what remained of his crumbling domain. Holed up in his office, he plotted countermeasures with the fervor of a cornered operative, dialing shadowy contacts for off-the-books favors. One call went to a crisis management expert he had used before, outlining a plan to discredit the videos as deepfakes, but the response was a flat refusal. Too hot now. Association would tank me too. Isolation closed in, each rejection a nail in the coffin of his former influence. He attempted to sway board members personally, scheduling urgent video conferences, but faces on the screen were cold, their questions probing his fitness rather than offering support. "This isn't recoverable," one said bluntly, hanging up mid-plea. The cascade was clear, no unresolved legal tangles, as the incident sparked no suits, but the court of public opinion ruled swiftly, motivations transparent, in every leaked email and viral clip. Elliot's arrogance had alienated even his inner circle, leaving no ambiguity. His schemes failed because trust, once eroded, couldn't be rebuilt overnight. Lilliana's uplift continued to unfold methodically. With the funds, she secured the apartment through a local aid program, furnishing it sparsely but meaningfully. A bed, a table, items symbolizing stability. Aid to her kin arrived via transfer, confirmed by grateful calls that evening, their voices lifting her spirits further. The path forward included enrolling in classes at a community center, focusing on advocacy skills to assist the unhoused, her experiences transforming into tools for change. Pride swelled as she refused to squander the opportunity. Every decision honored Harlan's acknowledgement, ensuring the gift amplified her strength rather than diminishing it. Strolling back to the shelter one last time to gather her few belongings, she felt the envelope's presence like a talisman, alive with the promise of renewal. Harlan's ethical foundation deepened the narrative of that night. After the fishery days, he pursued education on scholarships, excelling in finance while volunteering at local nonprofits, where he saw firsthand how valuing people led to sustainable success. A key moment came during a merger in his 40s, where he insisted on worker protections, turning a potential fallout into a model for industry ethics. This history clarified his motivations. No hidden agendas, just a consistent ethos that made his rejection of Elliot inevitable. He viewed investments as extensions of character, and Elliot's display in the rain had revealed a mismatch too glaring to ignore. Harlan's decisive stand stemmed from this core, a life built on lifting the overlooked, much like the note he sent Lilliana. Elliot's thriller-like desperation escalated as isolation deepened. He hatched a scheme to leak counter-narratives through anonymous sources, framing the incident as a misunderstanding, but outlets rebuffed the attempts, citing credibility issues. Rejections piled up, old friends declining meetings, influencers he courted turning away. The event's cascade was unambiguous. Viral spread led to advertiser boycotts, regulatory scrutiny on his firm's practices, and no loose ends in motivations. Harlan's ethics, the driver's integrity, public outrage all aligned transparently. Elliot faced the mirror of his isolation, schemes crumbling under the weight of his own history, realizing too late that power without humanity was fragile. In her new apartment that week, Lilliana unpacked, the funds enabling small comforts like fresh linens and a hot meal prepared in her own kitchen. Aid to kin manifested in their updates. Better health, continued education, solidifying her sense of purpose. The path forward felt tangible, classes beginning soon, her dignity the foundation upon which she built. Strolling the neighborhood, envelope now framed on a shelf, she embraced the aliveness, acknowledged in ways that healed old wounds. Harlan, reviewing portfolios in his office, reflected on the stand. His rise, marked by choices like divesting from unethical ventures, had prepared him for that moment. Valuing people wasn't strategy, it was principle, explaining the note and draft as natural extensions of his ethos. Elliot's schemes hit dead ends, facing outright isolation. A final call to a potential savior ended in laughter. "You're toxic now." The cascade clarified, no legal ambiguities, just ethical reckonings closing doors. Motivations laid bare, his empire folded inward. As paths reshaped, Lilliana's uplift stood in relief against Elliot's fall. The cosmos, in its quiet way, honored fortitude over malice, dignity prevailing where cruelty faltered. Tying back to the night's humiliation, the billionaire's downfall served as a stark reminder. Demeaning another could cost everything, the deal lost on the spot a symbol of greater reckonings. As the empire folded inward, Elliot Morse found himself adrift in a sea of self-imposed exile, the once impenetrable walls of his domain now reduced to echoes in an empty corridor. The cascade of events had left no room for ambiguity. Ethical reckonings had sealed every exit, motivations exposed like raw nerves under scrutiny. He retreated to a secluded villa on the outskirts, a property he had acquired in better times as a retreat from the masses he so often disdained. There, in solitude, he grappled with the total loss, the conglomerate's fragments scattering like leaves in an autumn gale. Shares continued their inexorable slide, recovery an impossibility as analysts declared the damage structural, not superficial. Board members, emboldened by the vacuum, accelerated their maneuvers, their communications a relentless drumbeat toward his ouster. Elliot stared at blank screens, the glow reflecting his hollowed features, reflecting on actions that had led to this precipice. In the quiet hours, memories surfaced unbidden, forcing him to confront the man he had become. He recalled boardroom battles where he had wielded words like weapons, diminishing colleagues to secure his ascent, each victory hollowed by the isolation it bred. A particular incident from a decade prior replayed, sidelining a promising executive over a perceived slight, only to absorb their innovations as his own, justifying it as necessary for the greater vision. These reflections hinted at potential growth, a fleeting acknowledgement that his methods had poisoned the well, but the emphasis remained on consequences, the bitter fruit of unchecked dominance. No redemption arc unfolded. Instead, the solitude amplified his regret, a mirror to the harm inflicted, underscoring that power unchecked invited its own demise. He paced the villa's halls, the silence a thriller in itself, tension coiling as media alerts pinged with fresh exposés. Media follow-ups built a subtle thriller tension, each report a shadow closing in. Outlets dissected the rainy confrontation with forensic precision, interviewing witnesses who recounted the slur's echo, their accounts fueling public backlash that swelled like a tide. Social platforms erupted with hashtags demanding accountability, former employees sharing tales of similar indignities, the ripple effects cascading into boycotts and petitions. One network aired a special segment featuring experts who outlined the timeline, the incident at 9:47 p.m., viral by midnight, stocks tumbling by dawn. No confusion arose. The full effects were laid bare, from advertiser pullouts to regulatory probes into company culture. Elliot monitored it all from his hideaway, the isolation intensifying as calls went unreturned, his network evaporating. The backlash wasn't fleeting. It embedded, ensuring stock recovery remained out of reach, the conglomerate's valuation halved and hemorrhaging. Lilliana Good, in contrast, channeled the funds with deliberate wisdom, securing stability that symbolized her unyielding resilience. The apartment she rented stood modest yet secure, a one-bedroom in a working-class district with reliable locks and neighbors who nodded in greeting. She furnished it practically, a sturdy table for meals, shelves for books scavenged from free libraries, each item a step toward normalcy. The aid to her kin flowed directly, a wire transfer confirming receipt within days, their messages of thanks detailing immediate benefits, a cousin's tuition covered, an aunt's medical procedure scheduled. Lilliana didn't squander. She invested in herself, enrolling in a certification program for social work, her experiences fueling a drive to guide others through similar trials. Helping at the shelter became routine, volunteering hours to distribute supplies, her presence a beacon for those still navigating the edges. Resilience shone in these acts, her path a testament to turning acknowledgement into action, without a hint of eroded pride. Harlan Reed's continued success provided a counterpoint, his investments channeling into humane ventures that amplified his principles. In the weeks following, he redirected the billion he had withheld into startups focused on community uplift, affordable housing tech, job training platforms for the underserved. His firm thrived, attracting partners drawn to his ethical stance, portfolios swelling as the market rewarded integrity. A recent deal with a nonprofit accelerator highlighted this trajectory, funding initiatives that echoed Lilliana's own aspirations. Harlan's motivations remained clear, rooted in a career of measured risks, his success a quiet rebuttal to Elliot's model. No loose ends lingered. His actions post-incident were transparent, press releases detailing the reallocations, ensuring the audience grasped the broader impact. The thriller tension subtly escalated for Elliot as public backlash morphed into tangible threats. Media dug deeper, uncovering old emails that hinted at patterned behavior, fueling calls for investigations. One evening, a protest formed outside his corporate headquarters, chants carrying over live streams, the crowd's energy a palpable force. Elliot watched from afar, isolation breeding paranoia. Were leaks internal? Would legal ramifications follow? But clarity prevailed. No unresolved issues surfaced, as the incident's documentation, videos, witness statements left no ambiguity. Timelines solidified the outcomes. Stocks irrecoverable due to sustained investor flight, kin like Lilliana's benefiting immediately from her stability, allowing her to send consistent support. The ripple effects touched suppliers, who shifted allegiances, and communities buoyed by Harlan's ventures. Lilliana's emerging hope blossomed in small, meaningful ways. Mornings in her apartment brought routines she savored, brewing tea, planning her day, symbols of reclaimed agency. Helping others at community events, she shared stories selectively, inspiring without self-pity, her resilience a model for those around her. Direct benefits to her kin manifested in updates, a nephew's school performance improving, family gatherings planned. The funds didn't erase hardships but reshaped them, pride intact as she built forward. Elliot's reflections deepened in solitude, hinting at growth's faint possibility, a journal entry questioning past choices, but consequences dominated, his empire's dissolution a daily reminder. Media's relentless scrutiny amplified isolation, follow-ups interviewing Harlan for insights, his humane investments lauded. Public backlash peaked in petitions garnering millions of signatures, demanding corporate reforms. Timelines clarified the irrevocability. Within a month, stocks showed no rebound, experts citing reputational scars. Lilliana's kin thrived directly, funds covering debts, enabling moves to safer homes. Harlan's success surged, his ventures launching pilot programs that aided hundreds. The chapter built toward Elliot's final humiliation. The board's call came at dusk, resignation demands formal and unyielding. Step down or be forced. The chair intoned. No negotiation. Elliot signed off, the click ending an era, his legacy in tatters. In contrast, Lilliana's hope emerged vibrant, volunteering at a local center, her stability a foundation for greater impact. The repercussions echoed, character arcs deepened, Elliot's loss a caution, Lilliana's rise a triumph, Harlan's path affirmed. The repercussions echoed far beyond the board's call at dusk, rippling through the remnants of Elliot Morse's once formidable world like aftershocks from a quake. His ouster came swiftly and without ceremony, formalized in a press release the next morning that stripped him of titles and access codes, his legacy now a tarnished relic in the annals of corporate history. No golden parachute awaited. The board, citing fiduciary duty amid the scandal's fallout, severed all ties, leaving him with a fraction of his former wealth and a non-disclosure agreement that muffled any attempts at rebuttal. Elliot's career ended definitively, not with a bang but a quiet deletion from company records, serving as a cautionary tale whispered in executive suites, a reminder that unchecked disdain could topple even the mightiest. He withdrew further into seclusion, the villa becoming a self-imposed prison, where days blurred into reflections that offered no solace, only the stark truth of his isolation. Lilliana Good, at 45, embodied a different trajectory, her thriving a steady bloom rooted in the soil of hard-won perseverance. The funds from Harlan had catalyzed change, but it was her inherent drive that propelled her forward. She transitioned from the shelter to her apartment seamlessly, her background of enduring street life, marked by transient jobs like cleaning or deliveries, always with an eye towards supporting her kin, integrating into this new phase without friction. Now, she channeled that experience into a small initiative, a volunteer-led support group at the community center, where she organized weekly meetings for the unhoused, sharing resources on housing applications and job skills. It wasn't grand, but it grew, drawing participants who saw in her a relatable guide, her age lending credibility and her story inspiring without overt disclosure. This endeavor embodied karma's reward, a cycle where her dignity, preserved through trials, now extended to others, creating a network of mutual uplift. She walked taller, her days filled with purpose, the envelope's impact manifesting in lives touched beyond her own. Harlan Reed's influence expanded in tandem, his role as an ethical beacon drawing acolytes eager for guidance. He began mentoring emerging leaders through informal sessions at his firm, sharing insights on balancing profit with principles, his post-incident ventures serving as case studies. One mentee, a young entrepreneur from an underserved background, credited Harlan's approach with reshaping their business model toward inclusivity. His portfolio flourished, humane investments yielding not just returns but societal gains, his decisive stand in the rain now a cornerstone of his narrative. Harlan's growth wasn't flashy. It was deliberate, mentoring programs scaling to include workshops on corporate responsibility, ensuring his legacy endured through others. Thrilling flashbacks to the rainy night wove through these resolutions, reinforcing the instant downfall's profound impact. In one vivid recall, as Elliot had bellowed the slur, a passerby under an umbrella, a young professional named Kira Lee, had pulled out her phone, recording the exchange with steady hands despite the wind. The video captured the raw vitriol, the word animals slicing through the audio like a blade, Harlan's rebuke following in crystalline clarity. Uploaded anonymously to a social platform within minutes, it spread virally, algorithms amplifying the outrage, views climbing into the millions by morning. This detail resolved any lingering curiosity about the spread, no orchestrated leak, just organic capture by witnesses equipped with everyday tech, the storm's chaos adding to the clip's dramatic pull. Another flashback illuminated the driver's loyalty shift. Victor had harbored prior unease, subtle incidents accumulating over years. Elliot's offhand remarks about those people during drives, a dismissed complaint from a diverse staffer that Victor had overheard. That night, the overt cruelty tipped the scale, his intervention born from a simmering conscience, no sudden whim but a culmination of quiet observations. Liliana's age and background wove seamlessly into her thriving narrative. At 45, she brought a maturity to her initiative that resonated with participants of all walks, her history of homelessness, from losing a stable job in a factory closure a decade prior, to piecing together survival through resilience, lending authenticity without defining her solely by hardship. It integrated as strength her kin's direct benefits, family visits now feasible, support evolving into mutual exchange, rounding her arc without gaps. Elliot's reflections in solitude offered no easy absolution, the total loss a mirror to his flaws. He pored over old documents, the conglomerate's dissolution a daily headline, but hints of growth flickered faintly, a letter drafted to former staff, unsent, acknowledging past oversights, yet consequences loomed larger, his tarnished legacy a barrier to reinvention. Media follow-ups sustained the tension, profiles labeling him a pariah, public backlash manifesting in lost invitations and closed doors. Harlan's mentoring extended his influence, sessions drawing diverse talents, his ventures funding scholarships that echoed Liliana's uplift. One initiative partnered with community centers like hers, creating synergies that amplified impact. All threads resolved. Elliot's ouster final, his attempts at comeback thwarted by the scandal's permanence, Liliana's initiative flourishing, karma's reward in her empowered aid to others, Harlan's growth through mentorship, his stand a catalyst for broader change. Flashbacks thrilled with their revelations. The recording's viral path detailed, driver's shift explained through accumulated unease, Liliana's details confirming her seamless integration. In the end, the poignant moral crystallized. Occasionally, a billionaire demeans a black homeless lady, but winds up the demeaned one after all. Dignity's victory over cruelty left no doubt, the audience satisfied with a balance restored, threads tied in a tapestry of justice.